Fantastic. Okay, good to see everybody. And we are in the middle of a conversation, an extended conversation. We began with political liberalism and the social contract, and we saw the development of the social contract and how it culminated in really the work of Rawls and Nozick. But we went all the way back to Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. And none of that was surprising because we take for granted the political system in which individuality is the architectonic value, the most important value. And liberalism in general is a series of a kind of umbrella term for political ideologies that hold the central problem of politics is how to protect individual freedom or individual liberty, right? And so we have created systems going all the way back to the Magna Carta, really, and the promises that were granted by King John to the aristocrats and only the aristocrats, right? And then, but those principles take on a life of their own, and they become embodied in the English Bill of Rights and in the American Constitution and other places throughout the world. And this form of government that we refer to as political liberalism or classical liberalism is how do we protect in the individual autonomy and individual rights? Now, Hegel, of course, would say that we're stuck in this truncated idea of freedom, where freedom is just what can I do as an individual, and I separate myself from nature and the rest of society. But that's where classical liberalism is. Okay. So we've created political systems that have representative democracy. And of course, we know that Rousseau's opinion of representative democracy was very poor. He was for direct democracy because representative democracies became easily captured by special interests. We have constitutionalism. We have a constitution that we take very seriously that protects individual rights from the tyranny of the majority, as de Tocqueville said, protection of civil liberties, a strong rule of law, due process. The law has to be applied in a fair manner, and the law itself has to be fair, reasonable. Political freedom, freedom of speech and ideas, freedom of thought, freedom of religious worship. A strong emphasis, a philosophical emphasis on individual autonomy and limited government, and a high degree of economic freedom. And this usually manifests in some form of market-based economic system. Generally, we refer to this as capitalism, although we know that that term is again an umbrella term for a lot of different types of mixed economies, but all respecting the rights of private property and the profit motive. So there you have it. I mean, this is what we take for granted. This is how we live. And nations that have adopted this way of living have tended to be relatively successful. But there have been challenges, and we have to take those challenges seriously. And one of the great challenges to political liberalism is Marxism. And we say, but what about rights, and what about due process, and what about freedom of speech, and this collectivism of Marxism? How does that protect the individual? Well, Marx kind of turns this analysis on its head and says, look, the economic system in which political liberalism thrives, and he focuses on the economics because economics is the driving force of history. This is all really just about economics. And the political system is just a manifestation of how we actually make a living with our hands. We get out there and we work, right? That all of this stuff is a facade. All of this stuff that we cherish and we hold for granted is a facade to protect the interests of a certain group of people. Which people? Well, the people who own the system. Not surprisingly, right? If you own the system, you can set up the system however you want. and you can placate the workers to a certain extent. And unlike Marx, later later thinkers like the critical theorists and stuff say, well, capitalism didn't collapse on its own, but the reason that it survived was by throwing scraps from the table at the workers. But really, the whole purpose of that was just to make them better consumers. And so we're fooling ourselves. We live a life of alienation. We're alienated from our labor. We're exploited. We're oppressed. And the things that we point to and say, oh, we have this tradition of due process and civil liberties and a rule of law, that's all a facade. That's just a way that the owners of capital can further exploit the workers and further alienate us from each other and our labor. And I think that was a very interesting conversation. And I always like to have the opportunity to go back and read Marx, because it's, again, I can't say this enough, Marx was brilliant. But on the other hand, the progeny of Marxism, the actual states that have ostensibly adopted Marxism, have been some of the worst political experiments in human history. And let me be clear about that. Okay. The best contribution that Mao and Stalin made to humanity was to die. That was the best gift that they could have given us, right? These have been monumental failures. Now, we shouldn't blame Marx for that, because nowhere in Marxism will you find anything that resembles any of the iterations of the Soviet Union or China, North Korea, none of that. But on the other hand, there has to be there's something there, and we should really think about that. We should really think about that. Now, the other great kind of modern challenge to political liberalism is on the other side of the political spectrum. Although some people like to conflate, Marxism and fascism and say, I think that's nonsense, and I think that's nonsense for clear logical reasons. The other challenge to political liberalism is fascism. Now, fascism, unfortunately, unlike Marxism, where you can, I have a whole shelf of books by Marx. And if I want to understand Marxism, I can go to the economic and philosophical manuscripts, or the volumes of Das Kapital, or even the Communist Manifesto. Unlike Marxism, there's no set of canonical doctrines which constitute a framework for the fascist state. There just isn't. As a movement, fascism is more about feeling than thinking. We're going to find that out, right? It is. It's a movement that is characterized by emotion and, feelings, rather than ideology and doctrine. So it's hard to talk about. And because there's no ideological or canonical framework for fascism, the term is habitually misapplied, usually as a kind of ad hominem. So any kind of vaguely autocratic or authoritarian government, you're going to say it's fascist. Why? Because fascism has been discredited historically. That wasn't always the case. Fascism at one time was a very exciting ideology, and many intellectuals approved of it. What changed that? What do you think changed that? It was the exciting new thing. It was exciting to be a fascist. And it was, many people, even in the United States, there were many intellectuals who embraced fascism. What do you think changed that? The Holocaust. Very, very tough to defend your ideology when it results in death camps. And after World War II, fascism was, was out. And the term fascist became a kind of pejorative term. Like to be a fascist was not great. Wasn't always that way. Does fascism still have adherents? Yes, and that's a problem. And we're going to see that, in fact, it never has gone away. You would think that, with an ideology that results in death camps would be, completely repudiated. That is not the case. And there are many people today who identify, maybe not openly as fascist, but neo-fascist, or there are there's all kinds of stuff going on. And particularly in Europe, there are political parties that are ultra-nationalist political parties that are essentially fascist in nature. Now, a great conversation is about what is going on in the United States, and is that fascism? Now, I'm not going to address that directly, but you guys can draw your own inference. Because I don't want to poison the well. I don't want people to go, oh, God, here we go again, or whatever. This professor is just rambling on. But you guys could draw your own conclusions on that. I'm not going to address that directly. So the term fascism is habitually misapplied, usually in a pejorative way, usually as an ad hominem. You're fascist. And that could shut down an argument. And it will shut down an argument from both sides. You call a person a fascist, you're saying, well, I don't have to deal with you. I don't have to think about your position. And if you're called a fascist, you're like, well, that argument is done. I don't need to engage with this person any further, right? So it's a way to shut down an argument for sure. Now, just because there's no set of canonical doctrines doesn't mean that there wasn't fascism. There clearly was, okay? It's just hard to make fascism in the bullet points. It really is. So fascism at its core is a type of populist ultranationalism. And this is what makes it much, and the people who conflate fascism with Marxism, they're going to have to explain to me how Marx, who was a true cosmopolitan, who didn't believe in the state, who believed that all people were unified, how can you reconcile that doctrine with ultranationalism? Doesn't make any sense, right? So to the extent that we can say there's an ideological core to fascism, I think the best, if we want fascism in a nutshell, this is what we get. And that's a Nazi slogan. And the Nazi slogan is this: blood and soil. And that encapsulates fascism, my friends, in a way that almost nothing else does. The people, whoever the people are, right? The people. And the people are always identified in terms of there's always something external to the people that's threatening them, okay? You have to understand that. The people are always under threat. But there is a people, right? And the people are united by blood, right? So there is a kind of racial, an inherent racial component or ethnic component to fascism. And so that there's another thing that separates it from just generic authoritarianism. Okay. There is a people, and these people are united by history. These people are united by place. They are united by blood and tied to the soil. The soil is sacred. The motherland or fatherland is sacred. This is what makes us who we are. The individual is subsumed by the blood, history, and soil of the people. We are nothing without that history, without that blood tie. Right? So it's not just about power. Fascism is not just about, oh, here's a way to get power or control people. It's a legitimate belief that we are special, that there's something in the blood, there's something in the soil that unites us, that makes us one. right? So for the true fascist, the greatness of the nation, the state is all that matters. The people, the motherland, the fatherland. That's what really matters, right? And that's what makes you you. Not your anything that has. So you can see the tension between fascism and political liberalism. What is political liberalism about? The individual. The state exists to help me be all that I can be. No, fascism is completely different. I exist to serve the state, right? The people, the blood, right? Blood and soil. Now, historically, there have been fascist regimes, starting in Italy. This is real. And look, some political theorists will say, oh, well, you're talking about fascism, you're only talking about Mussolini and what happened in Italy. Okay, that's a view. So even what happened in Germany was different from fascism. So there are like ideological purists. I mean, there are people who study this who say fascism only occurred in Italy. End of story. I'm not one of those people, but I understand the argument. We had National Socialism, the Nazi Party in Germany, Imperial Japan. Make a good argument that the militaristic government of Japan, fascist government, wasn't called a fascist government, but I mean, a racially based, ethnically based, authoritarian state. It really looks fascist, right? Austria, Brazil, the Vichy regime in France. We've seen something like this in Greece, Portugal, Romania, Spain under Franco. So yeah, there have been numerous instantiations of fascism historically, depending on how we define it, how narrowly we define it. But let's talk about uber fascism, where it began. What do we mean? Well, the best way to think about something is, well, where did the word come from? And of course, the word comes from ancient Rome. The fasces was a political system or a symbol. It was an axe head tied to a bundle of sticks. And this actually turns out to be a really, really good, and of course it is Roman, and that's not accidental, but this turns out to be a really good symbol for fascism, because fascism is about the collective power of the state, right? You can break one stick, but you cannot break a bundle of sticks, and that is the fasces, right? Is the bundle of sticks that is the symbol of. There was a kind of Roman magistrate, and this was the symbol of their power. A single stick can be broken, but the collective bundle of sticks cannot be broken. Our power is in the collective, is in the blood, right? So Mussolini. Now here's where a lot of people, when we throw around this, like this person is a fascist or X is a fascist, Y is a fascist. The de facto, the default kind of pejorative attack is that, oh, this person is like Hitler. Those conversations don't work because Hitler obviously killed 6 million Jews and 20 million other. So I mean, the conversations will break down. What we really should be saying was like, hey, this person's like Mussolini. Okay, then you can like, well, wait a minute, that makes more sense. Because Mussolini is an interesting example and obviously kind of invented fascism as a political movement. So he rose to power in Italy. The Italian government was in disarray, and he took advantage of this in 1922. And his supporters they wore black uniforms, and they were referred to as the black shirts. And so how Mussolini operated is he created a base of power outside of the state. He had his own followers, and they took power by threatening and using violence. Here is another characteristic of fascism. The fascists use violence or the threat of violence to take power. Universal characteristic of fascism. Fascism is like the violence associated with fascism is not just, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a feature of fascism. You have fascism, you're going to have violence. There's no, like, the violence is the point for fascists. So this is how Mussolini took power. He surrounded, the Italian parliament, the government, and said, we're going to start busting heads until you let us in. And the government of Italy was in such disarray and so disorganized that he was able to, through that, take power. And this set a blueprint for how fascist politicians operate. They create an alternative power base outside the government. Okay? You recruit people who are willing to get out there in the street and bust heads open. And that's how you get power. You don't rely on the mechanisms of democracy or elections. You can use those. But when it comes down to it, you will flood the streets with your followers and they will smash windows and break heads open until you get what you want. It's effective. Now, Mussolini did admire Marx. Hard not to. You read Marx, you're like, man, this guy's really smart. But he thought that Marx was wrong. He thought that all of Marx's focus on class warfare, that's just stupid. That's not going to work, right? Class consciousness can't be the driving force of progress in history. Mussolini was not stupid. He was well read. Sometimes he's portrayed as a clown. That is not the case. Mussolini was well read. He read a lot of Marx. He understood Marx. And he thought that Marx had made a mistake by looking at class consciousness as the thing that drove history forward. Not only was class consciousness divisive, unnecessarily divisive, you don't want to divide your society. You want to unify all the sectors of your society. You want the owners of capital on your side. You want the military on your side. You want the ordinary workers on your side. You don't get everybody together by talking about class warfare. That's not going to work. This idea of class consciousness is too abstract to really motivate a political movement. That's kind of true, right? So you need something more potent. You need an idea that really is going to motivate people to get out there on the street and get angry, right? So you want to tap into those emotions. And this all of this Marxism stuff, yeah, you can recruit intellectuals. Who cares about the intellectuals, right? The intellectuals get super excited about class, all the dialectic and all. No, that message is not going to work with ordinary people. And even Lenin, remember, Lenin recognized this, right? He's like, you can't get ordinary workers to read Marx. It's not going to work. So what you need is the intellectuals to lead the movement. Mussolini's like, that you're getting it backwards. The workers have to lead the movement, but in order to motivate them, you got to find a simple message that taps into something more basic. Pretty smart, right? He finds this in a French thinker named Gustave Le Bon. And Le Bon should be, he is pretty well known, but he should be better known because he didn't invent this idea, but he really was fascinated in the psychology of crowds. And Le Bon believed that the age of liberalism was dead. And the individual, no, we moved past that. But he also rejected conservatism and the idealization of the aristocracy. So what is he talking about? He's talking about moving beyond conservatism, and liberalism. To what? He argued that the 20th century would be dominated by the politics of the crowd. Wow. The politics of the crowd. The crowd is its own thing. It has its own dynamic. It has its own psychology. And Le Bon recognized this. Like people, individual people are, ordinary, decent. They have they have a moral sense. You get people together in a crowd, though. That crowd takes on a life of its own, doesn't it? Yeah, it really does. So Le Bon recognized this. He said, look, in a crowd, ordinary people could be worked up into an emotional frenzy, and they would sacrifice their own personal interest to the collective, this collective energy of the crowd. The crowd will also make them lose their sense of personal identity and responsibility. A crowd will do something that individuals would not do. So you can work a crowd up into a frenzy, an irrational frenzy. And the irrationality is the point. Le Bon argued that a strong, charismatic leader could tap into the latent power of the crowd by triggering strong emotions like love, hate, and fear. Forget class consciousness, right? Make them afraid. Make them love you. Make them hate someone. That's how you get power. Facts and arguments should be avoided. You don't write books on capital. That's the last thing you want to do. You replace all that intellectual stuff with symbolism and myth. Truth does not matter as long as the message feels right. The crowd doesn't care about the truth, right? So don't worry about it. Just make it feel right to them. The crowd works on emotion. You have to tap into that emotion because that emotion is the crowd's truth. If they feel it, they will believe it. So Mussolini, smart guy, using the psychological insights of Le Bon, he tries to create a movement that could harness the power of nationalism, populism, and violence. And so he gets together with this philosopher, this Italian philosopher named Giovanni Gentile. And they create a mythic history of the Italian people. And this is the perfect place to do that. Because as all of you know, if you go back far enough in history, you're Italian, and you go back far enough in history, what do you find? What great empire was in Italy? Rome. Rome, right? So Mussolini and Gentile realized that Italians have this blood history that goes back to Rome, the greatness of Rome. And you think about, man, Italy in the 20s and 30s, it's not Rome, okay? It is not great, but it doesn't matter because in your blood, you have the greatness of Roman emperors. Think about that. In your veins runs the blood of Roman emperors. the empire that dominated the world. That's the greatness that is within you, not as an individual, but as part of this history, of this tradition, of this nation. And so they take the symbols and the heritage of ancient Rome and create this mythic history. And that's going to be the basis of the fascist movement. And you can see why this will work so well, right? You put all of this stuff together, like you're baking a cake, you see what comes out the other side. So Gentili is an interesting guy. He's a Hegelian. And then we know about Hegel. Okay, so all of that stuff, all of that time we spent with Hegel, it's useful. Now it'll be useful when you talk about these modern philosophers, and a lot of them are Hegelians, like Marx is a Hegelian kind of, and Gentili is a Hegelian. And so what do we know that means? It means that there's a sense of history, that these are people that take history seriously. They take ideas seriously. They see a direction in history, and they believe that history is moving towards a certain direction. And Gentili, he checks all those boxes. Now, Gentili also believes in an absolute mind, which is a weird idea, but it's like this, that's where idealism leads you to this. Yeah, there's an absolute mind, and we as individuals are just reflections of that absolute mind. And so our private desires are secondary to the state. The state is closer to the absolute mind than we are, right? So individuals are less important than the state, than the nation, than the people. And so self-sacrifice and obedience to the state will enable me personally to achieve unity with something greater than myself. I submit myself to the will of the state, and I become greater for it. So where is great in political liberalism? What is the pinnacle of life? Oh, the individual, buying a house, having a dog, being able to consume, do whatever, go on vacation. Here we're talking about the individual to self-sacrifice to this greater idea of the people and the state. I become something mythic. I become a player on the world historical, field of progress and evolution. I become important. The individual becomes important, not on their own, but through subservience to the state. So Gentili argued that rights don't belong to the individual. They belong to the people as a whole, and that individuals must submit to the state in order to truly be free. Individuality has no meaning without the state, without the people. You're nothing. Again, blood and soil. You are who you are because of the blood, because of the history that runs in your veins, because of your connection to the past. And you are on a path to this greater future. And it's all part of a plan, the unfolding of history. And you are part of that great unfolding. Yeah. Now, Gentili also claimed that every nation is engaged in a kind of evolutionary struggle for survival. And it is the natural right of the stronger to conquer and rule the weaker. And in fact, this conflict is necessary for humans to progress historically. That we can only move forward historically through violence and conquest. So again, we see this theme in fascism Violence is not a necessary evil. It is not something to be avoided. It is the point. The conflict is the point. Warfare is essential to the state. It can unite the people. It can prove their superiority and greatness as a nation. So we must be prepared to fight. And believe me, there's always going to be somebody out there who's a threat to us. There's always going to be some alien. There's always going to be some other. And so we should always be prepared to use violence. And this is central to fascism as an ideology, right? Now, Mussolini was not entirely successful. And historians debate why that was the case. And it's an interesting question. I'm not going to get into that, but I mean, you just have to know that fascism didn't root itself completely into the Italian psyche. That there were always people who found Mussolini to be a kind of risible clown, that it just didn't, that fascism didn't take completely in the Italian state. But in Germany, National Socialism did. And National Socialism was the ideology of the Nazi Party, which ruled Germany from 1933 to 1945 under Hitler. Now, again, there are historians who study this stuff professionally who say National Socialism was its own thing, fascism was its own thing. But today, I feel very confident that we can identify both Italian fascism and National Socialism under the umbrella of fascism as an ideology. I don't think there was all that much difference. There are some differences. We shouldn't ignore those. So the main ideas of the Nazi Party, a virulent anti-Semitism. And again, this fits right in with this view that there's a people, there's a blood, and there are always internal and external threats that have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant. Like the best way to define yourself as a people, as a nation, is to point at someone else and say, we are not like them. So xenophobia is kind of part of this, right? Anytime you have nationalism, you have to say, well, what makes us special? And one of the things that makes you special is you're not like them, whoever they are. And in Germany's case, I mean, there was a lot of people, but primarily Jewish people. For a variety of reasons we don't have time to get into, right? So the main ideas of Nazism were a virulent anti-Semitism, blood and soil ideology. You were German because of your blood connection to the soil and the history of Germany as an entity. The notion of a master race. Now, this was not as prominent in Italy as it was in Germany. But the racial component of fascism was really the kind of definitive characteristic of Nazism. The Nazis were obsessed with racial purity. And of course, the idea that territorial acquisition to make room for the German people had to expand. Where would they go? And of course, politically and territorially, we must recognize that Germany does have indefensible borders. And countries like Germany or Russia that have indefensible borders, landlocked, essentially land powers. I mean, Germany is not landlocked, but it's a land power, land empire. The countries that have indefensible borders become aggressive because they have to push their borders out, because the only way to defend the country is through the practice of strategic depth. You have to conquer neighboring countries in order to create a buffer to protect the motherland. And so territorial acquisition for a greater Germany. So where would they go? They would conquer the Gauls, they would conquer the Slavs, and that would make room for Germanic settlement. Lebensraum, right? Room to expand. Now, in comparison with Mussolini, Hitler was far more successful in applying these ideas in Germany than Mussolini had been in Italy, for sure, absolutely. German fascism also focused much more on racial and ideological purity. Now, here's something that I think people don't appreciate enough. We get the racial component to Nazism, but there was also an ideological component as well. To be a true German, one had to not only be racially pure, but ideologically pure. So only Germans who embraced Nazism were true Germans. All others, even German citizens, were to be removed or eliminated. So you had to be a Nazi to be a true German. So within Germany, the Nazis targeted Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, trade unionists, social democrats, communists, homosexuals, intellectuals who did not embrace the party, the Roma, and anyone perceived as being disabled. Outside of Germany, essentially anyone who was not German was considered to be inferior. Now, intellectually, there was a philosopher named Carl Schmitt, and he was a jurist. He was a philosopher of law. And Schmitt argued that liberalism had failed. Schmitt became Hitler was very enamored with Schmitt. And Schmitt had argued that liberalism, political liberalism, had failed. It was time to replace liberalism. And those of you who know your history understand that Germany in the 1930s was ruled by the Weimar Republic. It had a representative democracy. And Schmitt said that it had failed. And in point of fact, the Weimar democracy had kind of failed. It was essentially dysfunctional. Schmitt asked the question, why does liberalism fail? And he came up with an answer. He said, liberalism will inevitably fail. Why? Because of its political toleration. Political toleration makes liberal states too weak to survive. Why? Well, all states will face political opposition, and sometimes they will face violent threats. When liberal regimes face violence, what do? They debate endlessly. We'll do this, we'll do this, and they debate endlessly, and eventually they become destroyed by their enemies because they're too weak to fight back. Or they fight back. They use violence. And as a result of that, they become authoritarian themselves. So either way, liberalism is destined to fail. Okay? According to Schmitt, liberalism undermines the state's greatest duty. A state must impose unity, not toleration, not division, not a plurality. We need unity to be strong, to survive, in order to achieve that unity, we must eliminate external and internal enemies, or the state will cease to exist. There is always a threat, always. There is always an existential conflict between true citizens and the alien other. The other is always trying to dilute our purity. The other is always trying to undermine our identity. And so the other must be resisted. This conflict inevitably leads to an authoritarian regime that is strong enough to do what is ever necessary to protect us. And that's really the theme, right? The other is out there trying to get you. So we need a strong authoritarian government to protect ourselves. We have external enemies. We have internal enemies. Liberalism cannot defend us from those enemies. We need a strong authoritarian government. So when we ask this question, what is fascism? There isn't really a central set of doctrines, but there is enough there to give a set of characteristics. There isn't a unifying, consistent ideology, but in practice, there are commonalities that all fascist regimes share, fascist and neo-fascist political movements share. And so we kind of can characterize what fascism does look like. And so what are those characteristics? Okay, so let's list them. Ultranationalism. The belief that the nation, homeland, or blood is sacred and superior to others. This is the defining characteristic of fascist regimes. If you don't have this, you don't have fascism. End of story. You may have authoritarianism, you may have populism, but if you don't have ultranationalism, you don't have fascism. There's just no way. The blood is sacred. The blood is superior to all others. The purpose of fascism is to make the nation great. Because the nation is superior to all others, there is an inherent right to exercise control over others. This is the defining characteristic of fascism. All fascist movements are ultranationalist movements. There's no cosmopolitan fascist movement. There's nothing that unifies fascist nations. Now, fascist nations can make alliances with each other. Nazi Germany and Japan made an alliance. But when historians look at that alliance, it's a weird type of alliance, isn't it? It's kind of an alliance of convenience. There's no real cooperation between the Japanese and the Germans during World War II. And this is disastrous. And in fact, in some ways, they undermine each other. Their strategies undermine each other. Why? Because the Germans do not believe, they believe that the Japanese are racially inferior. The Japanese believe that the Germans are racially inferior. So it's really, really hard for ultra-nationalist political parties to reach out to foreign entities and form alliances. It just doesn't work very well. Even the Italians and the Germans have problems, right? Two, the nation or the homeland is much more important than the individual. I, as an individual, don't matter. The people is what matters. The state is what matters. the homeland, the fatherland, the motherland. This is all that matters. Three, belief in hierarchy, natural hierarchy. Now, there's a tendency in conservatism to also believe in a natural hierarchy. So we don't want to conflate just generic conservative. Look, just because somebody believes in a natural hierarchy does not necessarily make them a fascist. And this happens a lot. So many traditional conservatives will argue for natural hierarchy. And yes, this is a feature of fascistic regimes. So there is, but we don't, just having this alone does not make you a fascist, in my opinion. So believe in hierarchy, political, economic, social, gender, or racial. So according to fascist ideology, nature imposes hierarchies of power and dominance that are inconsistent with the equality and respect presupposed by liberal democracy. This is yet another reason why fascism rejects political liberalism. Because political liberalism puts people in positions of power who shouldn't be there. Right? So there's a natural political hierarchy, there's a natural economic hierarchy, there's a natural social hierarchy. This really in fascist regimes, it really inserts itself into gender politics. Fascism treats gender roles as natural, and the gender hierarchy as natural. And fascist regimes tend to idealize masculinity and restrict women's access to work and education. After all, it is the duty of women to procreate. And fascist regimes have an obsession with procreation because that's how you make the nation strong. You have to have high fertility rates, right? And that's one thing that you have to do, because without those fertility rates, unless women are having lots of babies, your nation will not be strong. And so Nazi Germany had this weird kind of, they would award women, oh, you're having lots of babies, you get an award, you get a medal for that, right? And there's a kind of cult of fertility. And one of the characteristics of political liberalism and countries that have embraced political liberalism is you have women that have a high degree of freedom, economic and political freedom, and as a result, there's no pressure to have children. And as societies become more affluent, they tend to have fewer and fewer kids because kids become a burden. And populations go down. And so this is one of the things that that the fascists rail against, right? Authoritarianism. Fascist regimes are authoritarian, but not all authoritarian regimes are fascist. So we want to make that distinction. So there is centralized authoritarian power structure. Fascists often advocate for the establishment of a one-party state. Fascist leaders also have attempted to dominate many institutions and organizations that were previously independent of the state. That makes sense, right? The state is all important. And so the legal system, religious organizations, they will take over, every aspect. Authoritarians just are usually satisfied with obtaining power. It's not really about ideology per se. It's not about the state per se. An authoritarian leader just will use violence to obtain and centralize power. But the fascist, again, you have to look at fascism as the whole picture, right? Militarism. and a celebration of violence as an end in itself, not as a means, right? This is not political realism. This is not the acknowledgement that sometimes you have to use violence. This is the celebration of violence for its own sake. Martial virtues are celebrated. Fascists often use street violence to obtain power, and once in power, they will use violence to suppress opposition. Fascist states also embrace military force to restore or expand territory. So if you have fascism, you have violence. There's no other, that's it. That's one of the clearest indicators that you live in a fascist society, is that violence is not only tolerated, it's celebrated. And so you'll see a lot of violence, street violence, state violence. You just see a lot of violence. And that's not a problem for fascists. In fact, like I said, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Zero tolerance of political opposition or independent media. So fascist regimes have been known to suppress free speech and silence opposing viewpoints in order to maintain control and enforce their ideology. This will include censorship, propaganda, the use of force to intimidate or eliminate dissenting voices. Constant use of patriotism, songs, symbolism, flags, nationalistic mythology. This is much more effective than a treatise or a book or a philosophical manuscript. Symbols are powerful. And so you want to tap into, again, like Laban said, the mentality of the crowd. And crowds are motivated by emotions, not ideas. So the idea doesn't really matter. But you want to get people worked up. And so symbolism, very useful. And a sense of patriotism, again, that is tied to our identity, blood and soil, right? If you have a people that is unique, that is special, that is destined for historical purpose, you must also have a villain, right? Every good story has a villain. And so fascists are good at telling stories. And in that story, there will be a hero, the people, the citizens, the true patriots, they're the heroes. Well, who's the villain? It depends. But there will be a villain. There will be a scapegoat. And all of our problems are because of them. Right? Because national identity is the foundation of personal identity. Fascists see any foreign influence as corruptive. Anyone who is an outsider can and will be attacked. Immigrants, they're taking your jobs. Jews, they're conspiring against us. Communists are lurking in the shadows to overthrow the government. They're probably in the universities reading their books. That alone makes them suspicious. So these have been frequent targets of hostility in fascist regimes. Immigration is a great issue to use, right? Because the immigrant is foreign. The immigrant is not like us. And this is a difficult message in the United States because the United States is a country made of immigrants. And so this has always been a problem. Anytime one political party tries to get everybody worked up about immigration. It's a problem because, you think back and go like, well, didn't grandpa immigrate for some? Yeah, yes, but we ignore that. But like, think of the fascists in Italy. I mean that, or in Germany. These are not countries that have a history of immigration, and so it's much easier to get people worked up about racial purity or ethnic purity or something like that, right? What about religion? Now, religion, if we look at fascism, religion is not actually central to fascist ideology. It can be helpful, but it's not necessary. If we think about Italy and Germany, religion was useful. Roman Catholicism became the state religion of fascist Italy, of course. And many people in the Italian church capitulated to Mussolini. But that wasn't central to, I mean, like the state is the religion. There's not room for anything else, right? There just isn't. So religion, not all that essential. It's helpful. In Germany, it was helpful. The German churches mostly assented, with a few notable exceptions of people who were martyred because of their opposition to the Nazism. But most German churches capitulated, and that's exactly what you would expect. People are people, and most people. I mean, and before you get on your high horse and look, oh my God, I would have been the one to martyr myself. And please really think about that. Like, what would you have done? Okay. And when you really have had that conversation with yourself, then you can get up on your soapbox and wag your finger at all the people who capitulated. It's a dark place to have to ask you to go, but I want you to really ask yourself that question. Really, not what I say, but what would I have actually, your family's on the line, your job, all of that stuff. Would you look the other way? Probably. Yeah. So, okay, there's that. Fascism and economics. Now, it is a common refrain, particularly on the internet, to say that capitalism and fascism are go right together. Like, but that simply isn't the case. Fascist movements are not identified with any economic principles other than a general desire that the economy should help build a strong nation. Now, you can make an argument about Italian corporatism and how that economic system, worked with Italian fascism. That's fine. But some fascist regimes have nationalized industry. Some fascist regimes have tolerated private ownership of capital, as long as that ownership did not conflict with the interest of the state. That's the only thing that matters. Whatever economic system that you have, it has to build up the state. And that's the only thing that counts. Now, does populism always lead to fascism? And what is populism? And how can we distinguish populism from fascism? Dylan, I didn't read your comment. I'm sorry. All sounds familiar. Our current day political atmosphere. Are they usually narcissistic as well? Well, that's a really good question. And let's talk about populism. And let's separate populism from fascism and see where it leads us. Because I think part of the problem is that people conflate authoritarianism, fascism, and populism together. And they're not, right? They're different. They can work in harmony, but they're different things. Okay. So, what is populism? Populism is a range of political movements that claim to champion the common people in contrast with a real or perceived elite or establishment. Populists hold a deep suspicion of the prevailing establishment, which is believed to conspire against the people instead of working in their interest. Yes, demagogues often will use populism. Fascists have used populism. Narcissistic politicians will use fascism or populism. But it doesn't necessarily, we can't read too much into that. Populism is just a way to appeal to the masses, right? So characteristics of populism. Now you will see some crossover here with fascism and generic authoritarianism. Dividing society into two camps, the people and the elites. So here it's not necessarily the other in the sense that we saw like Jews or immigrants or outsiders or communists. It's the people versus the elites. Now we see this language today all the time, right? It's the elites. We're fighting against the elites. Who are the elites? Don't know. But it's not me. It's kind of funny when you see career politicians rail against the elites. The elites are always somewhere else. Maybe they're at Harvard, maybe they're on the East Coast or something, but the elites are doing something, and it's not us. We're not elites. Yes, we hold all the power. We control the military, we control the economy, but we're not the elites, right? And so you want to look for that language. And you know you're dealing with a populist, right? There's an antagonism towards intellectuals. Intellectuals are the enemy. Intellectuals are, they're in their ivory tower conspiring against the people. And so experts, intellectuals, anyone who's dedicated their life to studying a subject, you shouldn't listen to them because they're working against you. And they're not interested in the truth. They're interested in power. In fact, there probably isn't any truth. It's just power. And so you have to support the people who are working for you and not against you. And the intellectuals, people like Dr. Fauci or people who are, in a university somewhere, they're just concerned with power. They're not actually trying to help anyone. So you shouldn't listen to them. Using emotion to mobilize support, particularly anger and fear. Yes. Do the fascists do this? Yes. Do the fascists use populism? Yes. But populists aren't necessarily fascist. Hope you guys are getting this theme, right? All of these things overlap, but sometimes they're different. Now, here you go, Dylan. A charismatic leader who often violates social or political norms. That's a populist. That's a way to energize the masses. Look, I tell the truth. People don't like it. The elites don't like it. The intellectuals don't like it, but I say it like it is. And I don't do what all those other guys do. That's a populist. I don't care. Right? It doesn't matter to me because I'm on your side. And so you shouldn't care that I do stuff that's outrageous. In fact, when I'm doing outrageous things, I'm working for you. I'm trying to tear down those elites. Those elites and intellectuals are the one who's been oppressing you. Creating a perpetual state of crisis, real or imagined. There's a crisis. I'm the only one who can fix it. But didn't you make the crisis? Yes, that doesn't matter. Right? Aren't you the one who's responsible for this crisis? Yes, but there's a crisis. And I'm the only one who can fix it. In fact, because I started the crisis, I'm probably in the best position to fix the crisis. Kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? Sweeping promises of benefits based on illogical and simplistic policy solutions. Why haven't we fixed inflation? Easy to fix. I can fix it in one day. Why hasn't it been fixed? Because those elites and intellectuals, the people with degrees, the people from Harvard, the people at the Fed, they're the people who are rigging the system against you. I'm going to come in and I'm going to do some common sense things that will just fix it because I care about you. Demonization of political opponents goes without saying. A contempt for established judicial and political institutions, they're part of the problem. You wouldn't be in the situation you were in if the rule of law worked and the political system worked. Well, why are you suffering? Why is your life so difficult? I can fix it. And I'm going to go around those institutions. You shouldn't care about that because I'm working for you. Individual rights subordinated to the common will. And this is a hard pill to swallow or to make work in the United States, which is a country based on political liberalism and individual rights, but it can be done. And a strong intolerance for freedom of the press. Okay. So these are the characteristics of populism. Is there overlap with fascism? Yes, of course. But one is not necessarily the other. Populism does tend towards ideological extremes, both left and right, unlike fascism. There are left-wing populists, not just right-wing populists. Left-wing populists perceive the enemy of the people to be socio-economic structures and corporations. Right-wing populists define the enemy to be the other, immigrants, refugees, etc., the elites. But we definitely see both authoritarianism and populism on both sides of the political spectrum. And so that's definitely not fascism. Both left and right populists are suspicious of established political institutions and are authoritarian in nature. You can have left-wing authoritarians and right-wing authoritarians. They may use democratic means to come to power, but they work quickly to undermine democratic institutions. Populist leaders tend to reject any type of political or judicial intermediation that would limit their power because they claim to represent the people directly. When you think you have a mandate from the people, you don't have to worry about what judges say or other branches of or Congress or anything like that because you have a mandate from the people and that's all that matters. So that's populism, right? And we see populism a lot today, for sure. Absolutely. And some political figures actively identify themselves as populist. And so, boom, you know what you're getting. Right? People don't run from this term in the way they run from the term fascism or even authoritarianism. Some political leaders will embrace the populist, embrace that term. Okay, authoritarianism versus totalitarianism. And here we're going to look at a Jewish intellectual, a philosopher named Hannah Arendt, who wrote after the Holocaust and was very interested in this. And she said totalitarian movements are fundamentally different from simple authoritarian regimes. because authoritarian regimes only seek to gain absolute political power. They destroy their opposition and to gain political power. But totalitarian regimes seek to dominate every aspect of your life, not just politics. So authoritarians are concerned with political power. But totalitarians want to dominate every aspect of your life, usually as a prelude to world domination. So in this wonderful essay, The Origin of Totalitarianism, Arendt argues that in the 1930s, large numbers of people felt disconnected, completely disconnected from social and political institutions. Political liberalism had been discredited. It failed. Democratic and parliamentary governments were regarded as corrupt and oligarchic. They were. Political liberalism had failed in Europe. Such an environment was fertile ground for a mob mentality in which outsiders would be scapegoated and a political savior could be found. Here's a quote from Arendt: "The mob always will shout for the strong man, the great leader, for the mob hates the society from which it is excluded, as well as parliament where it is not represented." So the mob feels like they've been excluded from political and social institutions, and so they rebel. How do they rebel? They find a charismatic leader to coalesce behind to disrupt the system. A society suffused with anger and resentment will be hostile to the truth and ripe for manipulation by propaganda and misinformation. Again, you see that you read these things. Some of these things are from the 30s and 40s and 50s, and you're like, wow, seems prescient. Also, living in a post-truth society, Arendt talks about this. The totalitarian mass leaders base their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting their leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire their leader for their superior tactical cleverness. And this is exactly what happened. This is why you can't refute these types of movements with the truth, because the truth doesn't matter. Now, another work by Arendt was Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she developed this phrase, the banality of evil. And Eichmann was the architect of the final solution. Eichmann was the Nazi bureaucrat who was in charge. He was an administrative official in charge of the genocide. And Eichmann survived the war and was arrested by Mossad agents of Israel and brought to Jerusalem for trial. And when he was put on trial, Arendt was fascinated in a macabre way at his demeanor. Because it turns out that this man who was the architect of the final solution was a pretty pedantic and boring man. He wasn't a monster. He didn't seem like he was a psychopath or sociopath. He was by all accounts, a decent person who treated his family members with kindness and his neighbors with civility. And he considered himself to be a moral person. And when he was asked why he did what he did, he said, "It was my duty. It was difficult for me to do, but it was the right thing to do." He felt bad for the people who died. And he felt bad for their suffering. But it had to be done. And Germany needed people who were strong enough to do their duty. And this, for Arendt, was far more horrifying than had Eichmann been some psychopathic monster. And here's a very powerful quote from Arendt. Eichmann did not appear to be a sociopath, right? He was clearly capable of empathy and sympathy and was often distressed by the suffering he witnessed. In fact, he stated it was very hard for him to do what he did, but he was proud that he was strong enough to overcome his pity and do his duty for the fatherland. So here's the quote from Arendt. The trouble with Eichmann was that so many were just like him, and that they were neither perverted nor sadistic, but terrifyingly normal. This normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together, for this new type of criminal commits his crimes under circumstances that make it impossible for him to feel that he is doing wrong. And that is the scary thing for Arendt about totalitarianism. That individual conscience, our moral sense, is drained away by our commitment to the state. And in the name of the state, we allow ourselves to do unthinkable things, right? Ordinary people allow themselves to do unthinkable things. So is authoritarianism inevitable? Many political theorists, going all the way back to Plato, have said that liberal democracies, these democracies based on individual rights and due process, that they're bound to fail. That they're bound to devolve into authoritarianism. Plato argued that democracy inevitably led to instability as the uninformed majority would lack the expertise to govern effectively. The resulting chaos would create the opportunity for charismatic leaders to manipulate the masses with false promises, ultimately leading to their rise as tyrants. So Plato saw democracy as a weakness. Not because he didn't like democracy. He liked that the people, you could rule, the idea that people could rule themselves, but the people were uninformed and easily manipulated by demagogues, by charismatic leaders who would manipulate the people into doing what they wanted. And so Plato argued that democracy would would devolve into tyranny. Always. However, society with strong democratic traditions, robust institutions, a functioning rule of law, and active civic engagement can resist authoritarianism. We've seen this. It is possible. Checks and balances, a free media, an informed citizenry, and legal safeguards can help prevent authoritarian drift. But in the final analysis, it's up to us. So after the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin was standing outside in Philadelphia on the street, and a woman came up to him and asked him, what form of government do we have now, Mr. Franklin? And Benjamin Franklin looked at her and said, we have a republic, if you can keep it. because there's no guarantee. These institutions do not sustain themselves. And they are difficult to establish, but they are very fragile and they are easy to break. And if the people are not vigilant, democracy can easily devolve into tyranny and even in some cases, fascism. And so in the final analysis, we get the type of government that we deserve.